All right, let's dive right in. We're tackling the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement today, the AfCFTA. And what's really exciting is we're going deep into the actual legal documents, the nitty-gritty details. It's not just the headlines.
That's what makes this so interesting, right? We're talking about the potential to completely reshape African trade.
Absolutely. It's a huge vision creating one giant single market for goods and services across the entire African continent. The goal, of course, is to boost trade between African nations, spark economic growth. But I have a feeling it's not as easy as just getting rid of a few tariffs here and there, right?
You hit the nail on the head. The AfCFTA is way, way more than just tariffs. Think about it like they're writing a whole new rule book for trade, trying to make things way more fair and balanced. And one of the big things they're going after are these things called non-tariff barriers.
Okay, non-tariff barriers. Now, that's a phrase that sounds like it came straight out of a trade lawyer's textbook. Can you break that down for me?
Yeah.
What are we actually talking about here, and why should I care?
All right, so picture this. You're running a business in Kenya, you've got this amazing new coffee blend, and you want to sell it to a trendy coffee shop down in South Africa. The AfCFTA comes along and says, hey, lower tariffs, you're pumped, right? But then bam, you hit a wall. Turns out South Africa has this whole other complicated certification process just for imported coffee beans. That, my friend, is a non-tariff barrier. It's all the sneaky ways trade can be slowed down or even totally blocked that have nothing to do with tariffs.
So it's like hitting invisible speed bumps on the road to free trade?
Exactly. And these things can be just as bad as tariffs, if not worse. But here's where the AfCFTA gets really interesting. It tries to address these sneaky barriers head on. They even have ways for businesses to flag these barriers when they hit them, which I think is pretty cool.
That's a really interesting way to approach it, getting everyone involved. But before we dive into the nitty-gritty of how it all works, let's take a step back for a second. What are some of the big, overarching goals of the AfCFTA? What's the ideal scenario if they really pull this off?
The dream. Imagine this. Goods just flowing easily back and forth across borders without a hitch. Businesses, big and small, can tap into this massive market of over 1 billion consumers. And you see economies across the entire African continent becoming more interconnected, more resilient, more collaborative. But like any good dream, the AfCFTA has got its share of complexities, and one of the big ones is figuring out these rules of origin.
Rules of origin sounds pretty simple on the surface, but something tells me it's a bit more involved.
You're telling me it's definitely not as easy as just sticking a made in label on something and calling it a day. The whole idea is to make sure that the products benefiting from these sweet AfCFTA trade perks are actually the ones that have undergone significant changes, transformations within the AfCFTA zone itself. And that's where things can get pretty strategic for businesses involved.
Oh, I bet. Can you give me an example?
Sure, let's say you're running a clothing company in Ethiopia, right? You're making these really cool, stylish T-shirts that you want to export to Ghana under the AfCFTA. Sounds great. But if a big chunk of the fabric you're using for these shirts is actually coming from somewhere outside of Africa, well, you might not be eligible for those nice tariff reductions. See where I'm going with this?
I think so. So to really take advantage of the AfCFTA, our T-shirt company in Ethiopia would want to start looking for fabric suppliers within the AfCFTA zone.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of it. It encourages more regional trade, maybe even leads to some interesting new partnerships. But there's another layer to this whole rules of origin thing that I find fascinating. Special economic arrangement zones. They're like these zones within the AfCFTA that play by slightly different rules.
Hold on. Are we talking about loopholes here?
It's not so much a loophole as it is recognizing that each country has its own strategy for economic development. Think of it like this: a special zone within a country where businesses get special tax breaks or they're not subject to certain regulations. The AfCFTA acknowledges that these zones exist and sets some ground rules for how they interact with the overall free trade agreement.
So a product made in one of these special economic zones might actually get preferential treatment under the AfCFTA, even if it wouldn't normally qualify under the regular rules.
You got it. It's a real balancing act, trying to create a level playing field for everyone while also giving individual countries a little bit of wiggle room in how they pursue economic growth.
Sounds like a delicate dance.
Totally. Finding that sweet spot between boosting regional integration and recognizing those unique circumstances is one of the things that makes the AfCFTA so interesting.
I can see that. Okay, before we move on, I want to circle back to those rules of origin for a second. You mentioned these special zones, how things can get complicated. But for just your everyday products, how does the AfCFTA actually decide what makes the cut?
Well, for some things, it's pretty clear-cut. Think about products that are entirely made in one single AfCFTA country, minerals they dug out of the ground there, plants they grew, animals born and raised in that country. That's a slam dunk. They get a free pass.
That makes sense, but I imagine most things aren't quite that simple, right? What about things that are manufactured, put together from different parts?
Right, you are. When you start talking about those products with multiple parts, that's where it gets interesting. The agreement digs a little deeper, looks at where most of the value is added during the process, what major manufacturing steps happen where. It's all about making sure those benefits are going to the countries that are doing the real work.
So if I'm a company putting together electronics, it's not just about where I snap the final piece into place. It's about where the real value is being added.
Now you're getting it. And to prove all of this, that their products check all the boxes, companies need something like a product passport. That's where this certificate of origin
Hmm.
comes into play. But here's the thing. Even with something that seems as straightforward as fishing,
Okay, now you've got to tell me what's the catch with fishing.
well, the agreement gets really specific about where the fish is actually caught. We're talking territorial waters. Those zones recognized under international law. It's all about pinpointing that origin.
So a fish swimming around in a certain country's waters, that's basically considered born and raised there, even if it ends up being processed somewhere else.
You've got it. And this is a big deal, because imagine you're that company we talked about, sending trucks full of goods across multiple borders. If your fish isn't considered originating, you might get slapped with all sorts of extra tariffs along the way. That fish is going to get a lot more expensive by the time it reaches a market in, say, Ethiopia. It's all about making sure trade within the AfCFTA stays competitive.
It's like those hidden fees that pop up when you're shopping online, but on a global scale, right?
Exactly. And that brings us to another fascinating little detail in this agreement. They're actually proposing some changes to how they define their vessels and their factory ships when it comes to fishing. It's like they're always fine-tuning the rules of the game to make sure everyone's playing fair.
I'm intrigued. What's the story with these ships? What's the big deal?
It's all about being super clear about what actually counts as originating when you're talking about fish caught by these huge vessels. The current agreement just says their vessels, but it doesn't really spell out who "their" refers to. So they're proposing adding some more specific criteria about where a ship is registered or even who owns it.
So is this about closing a loophole that might let some companies bend the rules a bit?
That's the gist of it. If you've got a factory ship that's sailing under the flag of one country but doing most of its fishing in another country's waters, well, you can see how things could get messy. These changes are about removing that ambiguity and making sure everybody's playing by the same rules.
I'm noticing a theme here. This agreement, it's not static, it's constantly evolving.
You got it. The AfCFTA. It's not a set-it-and-forget-it deal. It's designed to adapt and grow as new challenges pop up and new opportunities emerge.
That's exciting in a way, right? Like the story of African trade, it's being written right now in real time, and this agreement is a huge part of it.
Could have said it better myself. But it's important to remember this isn't just about warm, fuzzy feelings of collaboration. This agreement, it's about laying down the groundwork for handling the inevitable disagreements, the bumps in the road that come with international trade.
Because even with the best of intentions, sometimes things go sideways. How does the AfCFTA actually handle disputes between countries? Is there some kind of trade court?
Not quite a courtroom drama, but definitely some procedures for resolving things. One of the key ideas here is this concept of trade remedies.
Trade remedies, that sounds like a first aid kit for trade wars.
Ah, I like that. Think of them as a safety valve that countries can use if they feel like their industries are being harmed by something unfair. Let's say one country suspects another country of dumping, selling stuff way below cost to try to muscle out the competition.
Not very sporting, is it?
Right. So that's where those trade remedies come in. The AfCFTA allows for temporary measures like extra tariffs to counter those unfair moves and protect their own industries. But even these measures have rules, and there's a whole process for resolving disagreements.
So it's like saying, hey, we're all for free trade, but we're going to keep it fair.
Exactly. And if things really escalate, that's where the dispute settlement body, the DSB, comes in.
The referees of the AfCFTA. Okay, how does that work?
Think of the DSB as this neutral third party. They provide a platform for countries to present their cases, sticking to the rules outlined in the agreement. It's about having a clear process for settling disagreements fairly and avoiding messy trade wars.
Sounds like a critical piece of the whole system. Disputes between countries are one thing, but what about those non-tariff barriers we were talking about earlier? It seems like those could cause just as much friction.
Absolutely, those NTBs, they're tricky.
Mhm.
But remember how the AfCFTA allows businesses to report those barriers when they hit them?
Yeah, that struck me as a really unique approach.
It's a key part of how they're tackling this. It's about fostering more dialogue, being transparent, bringing those hidden obstacles out into the open. They've set up a system for countries to work together to identify and hopefully dismantle those barriers.
So shining a spotlight on those shadowy corners where trade can get held up.
You got it. And that's important because NTBs can be really sneaky. Often they come from differences in regulations, standards, even just how bureaucratic processes work in different places. Things that might seem small on the surface, but they can cause major headaches for businesses, especially smaller ones without a lot of resources.
Can you give me an example? What are we talking about in the real world?
Absolutely. Imagine you're that clothing company in Ethiopia again. You're trying to ship those cool t-shirts to Ghana. You followed all the rules, your certificate of origin is perfect, you're good to go. But then your shipment gets held up at customs because Ghana have different labeling requirements for imported textiles. Maybe they need more detailed care instructions, or they have a specific way they want the country of origin displayed on the tag.
Even though there's no tariff, that labeling issue could mean delays, extra costs, could even kill the whole deal, right?
Exactly. And that's just one tiny example. It could be anything. Different safety standards for electronics, labeling requirements for food, packaging, you name it. These little differences, they can create huge roadblocks, especially for those smaller businesses just trying to navigate the system.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. You might get there eventually, but it's going to take some work.
Perfect analogy. And that's something the AfCFTA gets. It's about more than just eliminating tariffs. It's about trying to bring some harmony to those regulations and standards, making it easier for businesses to operate across borders.
It's about establishing some common ground for trade.
Exactly. And that's no easy task. You're talking about 54 different countries with different legal systems, different levels of development, different economic priorities. It's huge. But the potential payoff, it's huge too.
So how do you even start to tackle something that big? Do they just get all the trade ministers together in a room and say, figure it out?
It's a bit more strategic than that. The AfCFTA really emphasizes dialogue and cooperation. They use international standards as a guide, a common starting point. It's not about forcing everyone into one rigid system, but trying to find ways to gradually work towards more harmony a little at a time.
Building bridges between different systems.
Exactly. And to build those bridges, you need smooth, efficient ways to move goods back and forth across borders. That brings us to another really important part of the AfCFTA, what they call customs cooperation in transit. Basically, they're trying to streamline how things move at borders, reduce the paperwork, grease the wheels of trade, so to speak.
Because in the world of logistics, time is money, right?
100%. A shipment that gets stuck in customs for days because of bureaucratic holdups, that means lost revenue, spoiled goods, frustrated customers. The AfCFTA pushes for more technology, more automation, more use of international best practices at these border crossings.
So less time pushing paper, more time moving products.
Exactly. And it's not just about speed, it's about predictability. Businesses need to know they can get their goods where they need to go, on time, and within their budget. That's where this idea of uniform transit documents comes in, as they call it, in the agreement.
Okay, now you've got to explain that what are uniform transit documents and why are they such a big deal?
Well, imagine this. Instead of dealing with a mountain of paperwork, different forms and documents for every country they pass through, a truck driver can have just one single document that's recognized across the entire AfCFTA region for their entire journey.
That sounds like it would be huge for businesses. Less paperwork, fewer delays, and way more predictability.
That's the idea. It's about making cross-border trade as seamless as possible. And the AfCFTA, they didn't just stop there. They also talk about the importance of recognizing customs seals, making those border checks smoother. It's about creating a fast track for goods that are moving within the AfCFTA zone.
Like building a high-speed rail network for trade across the continent.
That's a great way to put it. They're laying down the infrastructure and putting the systems in place to unlock the potential of this massive free trade area.
It's been so interesting digging into the mechanics of all this, but before we wrap up, I want to bring it back to the bigger picture for a minute. What does the AfCFTA mean for everyday people? How does this translate into real-world benefits?
Now that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Uh,
Because at the end of the day, the AfCFTA is only a success if it delivers for the people of Africa.
Exactly. What's the dream scenario here? What does a thriving AfCFTA actually look like in action?
Imagine walking through a bustling market in Nairobi and seeing stalls full of high-quality, affordable goods from all over the continent. Imagine a young entrepreneur in Ghana building a successful business by exporting their unique products to this massive market of over 1 billion people. More jobs, more opportunities, higher standards of living across Africa. That's the potential here.
It's about more than just numbers on a balance sheet. It's about creating a more prosperous, more interconnected future for the entire continent.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Empowering businesses big and small, giving consumers more choices and better prices. It's about fostering this feeling of shared progress across the continent.
That's a powerful vision. But, like we've been discussing, the AfCFTA is complicated. There are rules and there are potential downsides. What's the final thought you want to leave with our listeners?
The AfCFTA isn't a magic bullet. It's not going to solve all of Africa's problems overnight, but it represents a huge step toward a brighter future. It's a journey that's going to take real effort, a lot of collaboration, and the willingness to adapt and learn along the way.
It's a story that's still being written, right?
Exactly, and that's what makes it so exciting.
Mm-hmm.
The AfCFTA is this amazing opportunity to reshape the story of African trade and development. It's a chance to move beyond those old patterns of exploitation from the colonial era and create something new, something more equitable and prosperous for all Africans.
It's a good reminder that the future isn't set in stone. It's something we build together, one step at a time.
Well said. As we see how the AfCFTA unfolds, it's up to all of us to ask ourselves, how can I be a part of this? How can I seize these opportunities and face the challenges head on as we move into this new era of African trade?
It's a call to action for everyone, entrepreneurs, policymakers, everyday citizens.
Exactly. This isn't just an agreement, it's a platform for change. And the time to get involved is now.
That's a powerful message to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the AfCFTA. Until next time, keep exploring.